Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. This show marks our sixth dive into the world of RPGs and Moorcock. In previous discussions, we've talked at length about the Stormbringer role-playing game and our experiences of it with a variety of guests, including ways of improving or hacking it to bring it more in line with our tastes and expectations, such as Ralph's excellent Storm hack system and Ted's extensive rules mods for Stormbringer. We've also talked about Moorcockian gaming in a sandbox with Dave and Clarky, and how making shit up on the fly and throwing it away is a truly Moorcockian approach. But there's lots more to explore in this arena. Whilst we've been thinking about this latest show, and my intentions of recharging my games mastering mojo have been gestating in the dark, other gaming options continue to emerge. Friend of the show, Jay Risa, pointed me towards Lobo Blanco 2nd Edition by Patricio Gonzalez, a fully realised RPG set in the world of Elric and now available in an English translation. I'll link to the itch.io page in the show notes. And, after years of sulking that it was only ever available in France, in French, Le Departement's Mornblade now has an English language quick start edition. A fairly beefy one too at 58 pages, so yet more to explore. But that's for further down the Moonbeam roads. And we touched on the Black Sword Hack Ultimate Chaos edition last time around with Gore and Gligovich. More on that to come. But in this show, experienced Stormbringer GMs Dave and Steve select a couple of suitable libations and drop by to talk about their experiences of bringing Moorcock to the gaming table, and the various developments of the Stormbringer and Elric lines rooted in the Chaosium RuneQuest framework. I even did a bad PowerPoint slide to accompany the discussion. Nerdtastic, although a true nerd would probably do a much better job, to be fair. So, assemble some victuals, sit back, fondle your dice, and join us as we chew the fat about bringing the multiverse to life at the gaming table. We are back in Derry and Toms, and we have a couple of first-time Derry and Toms visitors. First, we have, I should point out, both friends of the show, have been long-time communicators and supporters of the show, so it's lovely to have them both on board, but they're also both keen gamers. So first of all, we've got Dave. Hiya, Dave.
Hey everyone.
Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Zurich, Switzerland, from Fife, Scotland originally, but been over here for 14 years or so.
Cool. And we've got Steve.
Hello there. Hi, yes. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolute pleasure. And, of course, why are we here? Well, we've been talking for quite some time about gaming, about things like Stormbringer, about Moorcocking gaming, and you both run Moorcock campaigns, or have run, or are currently running, extensive Moorcock campaigns using Stormbringer or other system, and we'll get on to Stormbringer and systems and things like that in a while, because I've got something to share, which is probably a terrible use of a Sunday afternoon when I could be doing something constructive, like putting something in the oven for Phil for tea, but I'll show you what I've been up to in the last half hour shortly. But first things first, as is traditional, I think we're going to have a small slate of hopefully refreshing brews to accompany us on this little jaunt. So, Dave, what have you got lined up?
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I'm actually parched and dying to open this. I have a Qual Fresh, which is a Swiss beer, alpine water, yada yada, super pure. It's basically lager. All the beer here is lager, which is a bit boring.
Yeah. Well, when you say Alpine Pure, that just makes me think straight away of Sam Smith's Alpine Lager.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, in Yorkshire and various parts of the UK, there are Samuel Smith's pubs, which are interesting boozers in that they make all of their own beer. They don't have, even their own spirits carry their own labels.
Yep.
And they're quirky places, but when I was a teenager, Alpine Lager was the go-to cheap lager in a Sam Smith's pub, and they're very weird places, and I can see Steve's nodding his head. They're so weird that they actually bar things like iPads and phones and tell you off if you go on your phone.
Yep. We've got one in Newport, the Meringer. It was our sort of regular haunt for a long, long time. And I think the beer you're referring to, we used to call it Man in a Box, because it had a little Alpine guy
With his little hat and his pipe.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And you go in a pub and you just say, "Pint of man in the box, please." It was always our first, and all the bar staff knew. So it was, but yeah, Sam Smith's. They did away with their jukebox at a point about sort of 15 years ago, and we all said we're never going in there. Of course, that didn't happen. We just carried on going in there out of habit.
Yeah, I can't actually resist a Sam Smith's pub. And funny anecdote, when the pubs are reopened after lockdown, my mate Yaki was in one of them, and they had a yellow tape around the bar that you weren't supposed to cross. And there was a load of old timers propping up the bar, completely ignoring the orange tape. But when Yaki got his phone out, he got told off.
Shocking behaviour.
Yeah, amazing. What have you got, Steve?
Well, so I'm not much for a sort of a wacky beer drinking type, and I know you guys on this show. I sent you a message earlier on, sort of slightly, sort of a little bit of a friendly jab at it. But so what I thought I'd do, I'd keep it Welsh. So I've gone for a few Welsh options. So I've got a Welsh cider, Black Dragon. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Welsh pronunciation at the bottom because being from South Wales, we're not exactly great with the language. I've also got Double Dragon, Feeling Foul. I think it's Feeling Foul, but we call it Feeling Foul. And I've got, this is Lighthouse Gower Brewery, Lighthouse Lager. And that looked particularly cheap and nasty. But hey, when in Rome.
I had a Double Dragon when we were in Barmouth, and I brought some back. I can't remember what it was called, but it was a red ale, and it was absolutely fantastic.
Yes, may well be this one.
Yeah.
Some good
Very
beer
possible.
in Wales, isn't there? Isn't Gower your quality place, isn't it? I mean, this is Appenzell, which is like, mountains, rural. Appenzell labels usually a badge of sort of quality. I thought Gower Peninsula was all natural parking and really nice. No?
Oh, it's a beautiful area. I'm just more, I know you shouldn't judge a book by its cover or a lager by its label, but this looks particularly, it probably expensive, but doesn't look the greatest of quality.
Well, I'm going to roll a D6 on my wandering beer table because I think it's time it returned. But I've got a selection. I've got some Welsh beer. I've got some Scottish beer. I couldn't get any Swiss beer, so we'll just have to go with that. And I've got a couple of wild cards, one of which I'm hoping to avoid. But I'm going to roll, and I've rolled a number 3. It's the wild card. So I'm starting off with Wild Child Joyous Frivolity Cranberry Porter, which even though we've had a moratorium on dark beers, this is the last one I had in the house. So I put it in there. I should have put it at number 1, really, as Snake Eyes, but I put it in at number 3. So I'm going in with that. So while I crack this one open and give it a pour, let's just think. We've been discussing Stormbringer, the role-playing game, on and off in some of these role-playing game episodes on the podcast. And it does loom largest over all of the Moorcock RPGs because, of course, it was the first licensed RPG. But you've both been running Stormbringer recently, so we'll start with you, Dave, just because you're on the left of my screen.
Yep.
What is the draw of Chaosium Stormbringer, and is it the big player in the room when it comes to Moorcock gaming?
In short, yes. I mean, I think the trouble is, without casting aspersions, we're all older chaps, yeah. I mean, we're all, we were probably the early days of the hobby, and there was a split. Yeah, certainly when I grew up, you either played D&D or you played RuneQuest, and I think those that left D&D never went back because pages of lookup tables and all the arcanery around it were too much. Whereas any BRP game, whether it was it's not like now when you can get all the books in the shops. Generally, you wrote your own. It was all homebrew. All you had was a rule book, and maybe some Moorcock books at the library. I mean, that was, I think, what most of us ran when we started. So Stormbringer filled that perfectly. And then once you knew BRP, you could adapt it to anything. So when I came out of the deep freeze, as we call it, I don't know how many years ago now, let's say 5, the initial appeal for me was to return to what I knew, which was Stormbringer. So before I knew it, I was collecting, and I think I've now got a copy of everything from the Stormbringer line, most of the Mongoose stuff as well. But I think in terms of the game, it is Stormbringer. Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly holds a special place for me.
Now, did you discover Stormbringer the game before the books, or vice versa?
Good question. because we were reading Moorcock quite early, maybe about the same time, really. A friend of mine, he introduced me to the Stormbringer game and the book and Moorcock, so who lived along from me in the Coboard scheme where I grew up. So yeah, both. I mean, concurrent probably. I think I was reading Moorcock about 11, probably playing Stormbringer about the same sort of time.
How about you, Steve? You're currently running. I think you're into season 2 of your Stormbringer campaign, aren't you? So, What's your history with Stormbringer and gaming, and why is for you is Stormbringer the big one?
For me, we started. As a friend of mine, his mother was a lovely woman, but she had sort of quite different sort of views on the world. And one day we were all out, 10 years old, out in the streets. We come back and she's bought Tunnels and Trolls for him. So it was like, what,
nice.
What the hell's this? Like, so he read through it, ran us the first introductory scenario, Cave of the Bear, I want to say. Can't remember. It's a long time ago, and we loved it. Absolutely loved it. So of course that led into D&D, and from playing those games, we started reading all the different books. So we started getting into fantasy. So Zelazny, the Amber books in particular. Haven't forgotten on that one. I hope you're getting around to that at some point. But that's another story.
Yep.
Brilliant. Dragonlance books. I still got most of them. David Gemmell and all those things. And one of the books was Moorcock. In particular Elric. And it just blew me away. The whole idea of the multiverse, the brutality of the setting, how dark it was. It just literally is. It was almost as if somebody said, right, let's see if we can tick all of Steve's boxes, and it absolutely did. So of course we were role players already, and it didn't take much before somebody said, did you know that there's a role playing game of the books that you love so much? And that was it. It was a marriage made in heaven straight away. I've still got my original copy, still falling apart of Stormbringer 3rd edition, is it? I think
that's right. Yeah,
Games Workshop.
Yeah, and it's a thing of beauty. There's some lovely sort of pictures in there that now come out, unintentionally. And it's it was a simple system. It worked for me, and I've just kept up with the different iterations because I think, with the exception of Mongoose, and I know you want to talk about that in a moment, I kind of skirted that. It was a bad taste in the mouth 3rd edition D&D I didn't like, and I just thought no. I even bought the Strontium Dog role playing game and then realized that it was Mongoose, and it was like, no, okay, so that's just on the shelf, never used.
Yeah.
Long story short, loved the books first. It was just no brainer to run the game, and BRP in particular. It's just for example, the last campaign, not this one, and I'll say for why in a minute. I don't think I opened the rule book maybe 12 times throughout 3 seasons, so that's about 36 sessions. So because I just know the system off by heart, and if I don't know it, it'll be a multiple of a stat on a percentile. It's just too simple. Major wounds tables obviously are used a bit more often, but it's just too simple. And it allows me, and I assume other people, to be able to concentrate their energy into a story that's worthwhile, and not have to worry about the sort of intricacies of rules and the tables and the links. That side of role playing has never appealed to me. So I'm not saying you don't need that. You absolutely need that, but it needs to be a function to serve the story, not a the weighting of it needs to be right, and it needs to be much, much lower than the story, in my opinion, which is why I've stuck with it all the way through. The reason why I say I've looked at it more in this campaign is because the Elric's rules, although I like them a lot, there's a lot more to do with seafaring because my group are based on a ship. It's all so I use those rules quite a lot, and I have to check up on things. And the magic system is a bit more sort of expanded, and although it's not very Moorcock, if I'm honest, I still like it because it gives us the sorcerer characters a bit more to do, and so yeah, that's my long-winded answer.
When I rake at the back of my hindbrain to try and remember how I came across all of this, I was reading Moorcock a long time before I realised there was a Stormbringer role-playing game. Because I think my first experience was, like most people, with Dungeons and Dragons. It was AD&D. I think I was 11 years old. I was into fighting fantasy books. Someone said, come and play Dungeons and Dragons. So that's how I got into role-playing games. Then fast forward 5 or 6 years, I'm at college. I'm 16 or 17. And I hear some kids behind me talking about Dungeons and Dragons. And I peek my head over the partition and talk to them. And later that evening, I'm round their house with my player's handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide running a game for them.
Brilliant.
Start running games for these guys. Some of them are still friends to this day. And one of them, a couple of weeks later, turns up with a copy of Stormbringer 3rd edition by Games Workshop. Already, the spine is cracked, and he's only had it a couple of weeks. And he also had that Corgi Tunnels and Trolls paperback as well. And I didn't know Tunnels and Trolls existed either. So that's when I discovered that there was actually a role-playing game of Michael Moorcock. Because, of course, back in those days, if they didn't have it in your local gaming store, it might as well not have existed. And my local gaming store seemed to be all Dungeons and Dragons. I think there was RuneQuest box sets and things like Phoenix Command supplements, which were just too much to cope with. But I think for the benefit of people who listen to this podcast, and when we're talking about BRP and Mongoose and things like that, we'll have Scooby-Doo, what we're talking about. So I'm going to enter into work mode, and I'm very quickly going to share my screen and show you the ridiculous task that I assigned myself this afternoon. And as I'm thinking about it, I've already forgotten one, but I'm going to throw this up on screen. And this is
the flowchart.
The flowchart for Chaosium, the lineage of Stormbringer and how it all came about. So, back in the day, in the mists of time, there was the 1st edition RuneQuest. And some of these arrows are probably in the wrong places. Chaosium created a role-playing game called RuneQuest, which was loosely based on Greek myth and is a very popular role-playing game. It's a very, very detailed background that people are really, really into. But for these purposes, the interesting thing about RuneQuest was it was one of the earliest iterations of what became to be known as Chaosium's basic role-playing system. So when we refer to BRP, we're talking about the basic role-playing system, which also was the fundamental basis of Ringworld, ElfQuest, and various other games that emerged over the years. I think Thieves' World might have used it anyway. So Chaosium, the big... Call of Cthulhu, of course.
Yes,
how could I forget that? So Chaosium are really the big competitor, I suppose, in many ways to Dungeons and Dragons, along with Traveller, which we won't talk about, with the science fiction game. But Stormbringer 1st edition emerges from the RuneQuest rules. Ken St. Andre and Steve Perrin create Stormbringer. Beautiful box set, that great Frank Brunner art on the cover. A very, very modified version of the RuneQuest rules. We get Stormbringer 2nd edition. We get the Hawkmoon box set as well that comes out of that line, which was originally badged to be part of an Eternal Champion role-playing game line. But it never really happened. We never got the originally intended Chaosium line. So we end up with this parallel track of RuneQuest developing through various editions and Stormbringer developing through various editions. And there's a similarity in that both lines ended up with a UK-published Games Workshop edition, which fell to bits because their binding was so terrible. And the Call of Cthulhu 3rd edition was published by Games Workshop and fell to bits because the spine glue was terrible. So we get Stormbringer 3rd edition. Then we move on and we get Elric ! For whatever reason, they remove the Stormbringer branding, and we get Elric ! Which brings it a little bit more in line with the RuneQuest rules, gets rid of a lot of the Gonzo elements, which is in some ways a shame. I don't mind the Elric system, but it does that wild swinginess of the Stormbringer system. It smooths over a little bit. Then we get Quorum by Darkside. Not a Chaosium publication, a licensed Quorum role-playing game, which is based upon those same Elric rules, which I think is probably one of the finest Moorcock-based publications that have ever been produced in role-playing game form. And then we get Stormbringer 5th, which is really a revised version of Elric, with the font size blown up, so it can be twice as thick a book, but it does have a wonderful cover. And then the Stormbringer, the classic Stormbringer line, grinds to a halt, except years later, with all of the Moorcockian file numbers filed off, it ends up being republished essentially as a game called Magic World. And if you can still get a copy of Magic World, it's pretty decent. But what happens at that point? Well, The RuneQuest license is granted to a British company called Mongoose, and we get the first iteration of RuneQuest by Mongoose. Now, you'll see I've coloured the boxes grey for Mongoose Grayscale, not because I lack imagination, but I always associate Mongoose rules with grey.
It's horrible to read, isn't it? I mean, I struggle with those books, you know.
Yeah. But interestingly, not only is it grayscale and terrible to read, but the Hawkmoon hardcover that comes out bears a remarkable similarity to the GW Stormbringer 3rd edition in that it falls to pieces if you look at it. So we get the Elric of Melniboné rules, we get the Hawkmoon rules. Then, because Mongoose RuneQuest 1 is such a basket case and so broken in terms of system, we get revised Mongoose RuneQuest 2, which brings quite a lot of nice developments. Things like the combat manoeuvres stuff is actually quite nice in Mongoose RuneQuest 2. The system is tidied up. We then get the Elric of Melniboné 2nd edition through Mongoose, which, again, is built upon those rules. We don't get a 2nd edition of Hawkmoon. But then, Mongoose lose the license to RuneQuest. So we get this mad process of about 3 or 4 years where Mongoose RuneQuest 2 is rebadged as Legend. And then the authors of Mongoose RuneQuest 2 and Legend, Pete Whitaker and Lawrence Nash, take that system with them, create the design mechanism, they get the license to RuneQuest, it becomes RuneQuest 6, which is absolutely baffling. It's incredibly difficult to keep track of, but then they lose the license to RuneQuest and they rebadge it as Mithras. And Mithras is currently, out of all the things we've just discussed, is the only one actually still in print. And just out of interest, they also do a supplement for Luther Arkwright, and they do Lioness, and both of those are currently in print. Lioness based on Jack Vance. Meanwhile, we have a couple of French games by Le Departement, Mournblade and Hawkmoon, which use a completely different system called Choose Your Dice, which I haven't really looked into too deeply. But the one I've forgotten to put on this chart is Dragon Lords of Melniboné.
The D20 one.
The D20 one, because of part of the D20 boom, Mongoose decide they've got the license, so they do a D20 version of Elric of Melniboné. And they call it Dragon Lords of Melniboné.
And it's literally a lift and shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
You know, they divide it by 5.
Yeah. So that is what I wasted half an hour on this afternoon and still forgot to put Dragon Lords of Melniboné on. But for listeners, this is essentially what we're talking about when we talk about this throughput, this line of Moorcock role-playing games that are officially licensed. Now, of course, there are probably dozens of role-playing games out there that claim Moorcock as a reference point in their design. One of them, of course, is Black Sword Hack, which will just have the 2nd edition of release through Kickstarter, the Ultimate Chaos Edition, which is very, very heavily Moorcock influenced and wears its badge entirely on its sleeve. But yeah, so we've gone through this entire process, and interestingly again, Moorcock views a lot of this very, very dimly. He didn't think that Chaosium treated him particularly well, which is why he withdrew the license from them. No idea what he thought of the Mongoose publications, but there we are. Dave, have you purely just used Stormbringer, or have you have you dabbled in any of the others?
I've gone right through all of those. So when I came out the Deep Freeze, I got a hold of Stormbringer box set, which I think is the 2nd edition one, the Brunner artwork. In my opinion, that's the ultimate Stormbringer edition. But the challenge I had was running games here in Switzerland. There were D&D crowds, really not many of them even knew about Moorcock, and it was a hard sell. So I moved it to Elric. Elric was a bit more user-friendly, if you like, but I felt Elric was too dumbed down. The magic was a bit more like RuneQuest battle magic. Everyone had it, and I just thought it took the edge off. So I wasn't really happy with the Elric. I got a hold of Quorum. Love Quorum. I think that's the best rules for a Moorcockian game that there are. I mean, I then got through Virtual Grog Meet and Twitter and the online community, I moved my gaming online, and that was really when it shifted up a gear, and I got into Mithras. Well, I started with Mongoose RuneQuest 1 because there was a character sheet on Roll20. Went off that quite quickly onto RuneQuest 2 on top of Mithras, and that runs really nicely. and then I had some problems with my eye, and I've recently I had to stop GMing for a while. So coming back and, taking time out and thinking about all this, I'm now moving towards Savage Worlds and Swadebringer, because from my point of view, the challenge on all of these is to sell to a modern crowd and to be supported on a virtual tabletop. And I think Stormbringer's a hard sell because ultimately you're crap. Yeah, I mean, I think my favourite character in Stormbringer was a beggar, but not a lot of people want to go that route, and not a lot of people get it. And I always struggled. I mean, for me, the benchmark that I would use how would I run this would be the Mordaga's Shield, which I've got a one shot for, and if you think about how epic that story is, where they fight the trees, the leaves that drain your blood, the giant at the end that they end up killing, and he ends up killing him. Sorry about the spoilers. He ends up killing his friend. How would you run that in Stormbringer? Yeah. The party would die at the first tree, So that's part of the appeal for Savage Worlds, because with the whole raises and bennies, and it's just bonkers, and to me and feel it's a lot more like the early days of running Stormbringer. It's a lot more unpredictable, a lot wilder. So that's the direction I'm going. But I have run all of these, what I tried to do was introduce people through, I'd pick out the weirder or the more Moorcockian scenarios, like the Infinite Cathedral from the Stormbringer, what the book is, Perils of the Young Kingdoms, maybe. But, it's a hard sell, and trying to motivate a Moorcockian story for a modern crowd in a virtual environment, there's quite a lot of constraints there about system, rules, flavour. So that was the path that I took.
Yeah. So, Steve, you've been running Stormbringer. Are the players all familiar with Moorcock, or is this something that you've had to sell turn-wise?
So I've been running it since 3rd edition. So, around about 35 years. Much like Dave, I did go through a deep freeze phase. I think like everybody, life happens, and suddenly it's like, well, I can't stay up till 5 a.m. playing overnight as over my friend's house.
Oh yeah, it's rubbish, isn't it?
Oh, it's horrendous.
I hate that we can't do that anymore.
How dare they demand that I earn my money? But yeah, so I've run it for so long, and thankfully I got a reputation for it. So in our sort of gaming community in Newport and slightly wider to Cardiff, I was lucky enough to be in a position where people would be asking me to play. Now, it's not me trying to blow my own trumpet here. That's purely me saying that the hard sell element wasn't needed, and I think it's definitely not down to the content. I think it's just the style of the way I run is very much sort of action packed. It's why I kind of tilted towards this sort of even referring to it as seasons and episodes, because I kind of felt that I was more comfortable in a realm where I was structuring the campaign in that way, so that the beginning, middle, end, and sort of a plot arc, sort of Straczynski Babylon 5-esque type of bigger idea for the long run, peppering things throughout. Anyway, I digress. So I was lucky enough in that respect that at one point I think I ran 3 groups: 1 law, 1 balance, 1 chaos. 6 in each, 18 players, and I was running in the same universe and the same timeline, and each of these groups would affect things that would happen to the other group in different parts of the Young Kingdoms. And to be honest, that was born slightly out of me trying to push myself, but also out of the fact that I was having people saying to me, what's wrong with me? Why won't you run for me? So I had to cater for. And again, not blow my own trumpet. I'm not that guy. I was just lucky enough. But I'd reached the point where it's saturated, and I just said, look, I can't run it anymore. I've done all the stuff in the books. I've brought Coram books into it. I've brought the Hawkmoon stuff into it. I've done everything I wanted to do, and now I'm just feeling like I'm, retreading water. And I went through that deep freeze, and one of my old players, basically messaged me separately and said, "Oh, if you ever feel like it, I'd be up for playing." And since then, I've started to bring other people in. So what I've done is I wrote a couple of pages which basically laid out what in my mind a Stormbringer or Moorcock-esque game is. So, dark themes, gory. It's called the Young Kingdoms because people don't get old. Death is quick and easy, and nothing is safe. D&D, a sword hits you, you can take that all day if you're a fighter of a certain level. Whereas in this system, a sword the size of a sideboard hits you, you're probably not getting up. And getting that sort of message across in a few bits of paper, and also the difference between the alignments, because people sort of go instantly chaos is evil. No, actually that's not strictly true. They're just random. They're very okay, they're selfish and whatnot, but they're not necessarily evil. Whereas law is good is also not right. I mean, in my current campaign, law are without doubt the bad guys. They're imposing order on the Young Kingdoms, and as it, because I tried to do something a bit different. I wanted it to be, that sort of juxtaposition. Whereas normally chaos are the ones being, taken to court. Whereas now I wanted that to be the roles reversed, where chaos are actually scrambling, trying to get together some sort of rebellion. So yeah, to answer your question again, apologies for the long-winded answer, but in the past it wasn't a problem. In the current times, I've got about half and half. And for those that don't, I've got this little write-up that I give them at the start and say, look, this is a flavour for what you're going to get in the world of Moorcock.
You're entirely homebrewed, Steve. Yeah, you're writing all of this. You're not. These aren't out of source books, this is all coming from you, correct?
100%, yeah. So for many years now, I've written my own stuff. That when I mentioned about the 3 parties and the 18 players, all mine. The end fight was all the survivors of those groups at the end of time. So I take cues from the books, but I write my own sort of journey to get there. And to coin a phrase I've heard Andy say a couple of times, all my characters, all my players, they're all shit kickers. I think, pardon my French, was the beautiful term that Andy used. Yeah. And that's something I've used since when talking to my players. Don't misunderstand me. You'll be doing heroic things, but you'll probably die doing them because you're a shit kicker. Don't ever forget that you're just, in the grand scheme of things, you're probably being used by the gods. You're certainly not Elric, and you're not an eternal champion. Get that idea out of your mind now. You're probably going to die. We've had 2 character deaths the last 2 sessions as it goes. So it happens, yeah. But shit kickers has stuck. So thanks for that, Andy.
Well, it's just a reflection of my favourite style of game. And it's funny, thinking about role-playing games and my opinion on role-playing games and things like that, I always find it problematic in my mind, just when it comes to verisimilitude, that if you're playing a game and you look at the system and the likelihood is that the average character will have a certain capacity to take damage, whether we call it hit points or whatever we're going to call it, and then a firearm has a certain capacity to cause damage, and from the very, very off, a firearm cannot kill a character unless they take several hits. That, to me, instantly destroys my opinion of a game, because I want the players to face risk. I think drama needs risk. I think drama needs the risk of death. And I'm not knocking anybody at all who wants to play D&D up to 20th level or whatever. But I always found when I played D&D back in the day, we never ever got to epic level because it got boring at that point. It got boring, the point where if things become, if the atmosphere becomes febrile and violent, then you enter into a 35-minute dice rolling session. And that just turns me off completely. As a GM, funnily enough, I understand why that's appealing. Because when it comes to preparing for a game, if you know that a 4-hour session, 3 hours of it will be 2 fights and shitloads of dice rolling, that actually makes it extraordinarily easy to GM a long session for players when you know straight away that if you put 3 fights in, I've played, dungeon crawls where you get through 3 rooms in 3 hours because the fights take so fucking long. That, to me, it's just not... I understand why people like that stuff. For me, it just becomes tactical simulation, not realistic simulation, but it's not for me. It bores me. Okay. I would rather have a group of players who do everything they possibly can to avoid getting into a fight because they don't want their characters to come a cropper. That's what I like. Yep. So years and years and years ago, I think the most successful and enjoyable game I've ever run, I ran a game of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, for a bunch of people who played Warhammer Fantasy Battle primarily. And all of their characters were, in the battle, they were all heroic. I've never played Warhammer Fantasy Battle, so I don't really know how it works. So they came to play my game, and where they've been playing war games where certain beasts, chaos beasts, were dispatched left, right, and centre by these heroic figures, we had this game where they were, I think one of them was basically scrubbed the steps at the local temple. He was a novice. One of them was a charcoal burner or something stupid like that. And one of them was a gravedigger, and another one was an agitator. And they were all so useless. Because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplayer, if you get in a fight with beginning characters, it's a recipe for disaster. And the game was simply, they had to go and get some sausages from the local, from a nearby village, so they could bring it back for Sigmar Fest at the local temple. But there were some complications along the way that included bandits, an injured chaos beast man in the forest causing havoc, just silly little things. And there was a local village which was being tainted by chaos. Right, okay, so easy peasy. That's the task. They're the local complications. Players, what we're going to do. And it was absolutely fantastic because it got to a point where some bandits tried to mug them in the woods and get the sausages off them, and they used social skills to avoid getting into a fight with them, agreed that half of the sausages the bandits could take in return for the agitator getting some kind of agreement with them that they would get involved in local politics and support him when it came to an argument in a town square or something. And this took 4 hours. It was absolutely brilliant. They all loved it, and that to me is really enjoyable gaming. This like epic level combat and epic level stuff, it's all right. It's all right, but I just prefer, I like shit kickers in games, and I like to play shit kickers. So Dave, your point about playing a beggar, recent Moorcock Tolkien weekend, we played a game in the afternoon, which was Dungeon Crawl Classics was the system, but I was a Nodsakorian beggar with a hook for a hand, and I had a great time. Because all I could do was sneak and pick people's pockets. I couldn't do anything else. And I loved it. Just right up my street.
But that description of the combat, I hadn't thought about it before, because really all I knew was BRP. And, and one of my players, we were doing the, what's it called? Pride of Pyre or something. The one with the battle barge, ghost ship from one of the source books. And we had this epic combat. And afterwards he said to me, Dave, I like the game, but combat takes too long. Hit, parry, hit, parry, hit. You're basically waiting for someone to miss a parry, and then you might total them, And I hadn't thought about it before, but Mithras, I think, had a real problem with that. It was actually quite hard to kill people, because I had another player say to me, we've played Rogue Mistress almost right through the epic campaign, which is superb. He said, no one's died. It doesn't feel like there's a risk of death in this, I took all that on board. So the long combats and the risk of death, and part of it was me as a GM. It took so long, I felt, to roll up a character for Elric of Melnibone 2 on Mithras. I was reluctant to kill people. And combats took forever. And that was another factor that drove me towards Savage Worlds, which in combat feel is a lot more like early Stormbringer. You could be one shot, bang, gone, dead. The guy rolls a 10 on his longsword, you roll a 1-1 on your wooden Weeping Waste armor, so you've got no armor, boom, major wounds, your legs off, or whatever, To me, Savage Worlds has a lot more of that feel. It's faster. You're not into this hit parry cycle. It's pretty much resolved there and then. And that was where I went that way.
I think in old money they call that whiffy, don't they?
Okay.
Where combat gets whiffy, where it's just like whiff, you miss, plonk, you parry, whiff, you miss, and it just goes on and on and on. Yeah. If you're listening, Clark, I apologise, but GURPS is the worst iteration of that I've ever come across, I think. And Clark, you won't mind me saying, but an hour and 10 minutes to run something that in real time probably lasted 2. Was just too much for me. Once it gets simulationist, it all gets a little bit much for me. But there's lots and lots of super simple systems out there, and I do like BRP. So that's, again, for people Yeah, for people who don't really game or are only aware of Dungeons and Dragons or something like that, what is BRP? Well, it's fairly simple. Everybody has core stats, but everybody also has a skill list, which generally 0 to 100, and you roll two 10-sided dice to create a number between 1 and 100, and if you roll under your skill, you're successful. There have been all sorts of developments of it, like degrees of success and various other bits and pieces over time, and I think 7th edition Call of Cthulhu introduces some new things like automatically passing skill tests if your skill is a certain level. But that's essentially the core of it. And I think that's why it's so intuitive and easy. And Steve, you made the point that once you've played BRP a few times, you don't need to pick up a rule book.
Yep.
And it's the case that, Call of Cthulhu is a game I always end up going back to over the years. For whatever reason, I've always gone back to Call of Cthulhu. One is because if you're playing with a group of players who don't want to understand complex lore, everybody can identify with being a gumshoe in the 1930s, or a librarian, or an antiquarian, or if you want to play it in the 1980s, whatever. Everybody can identify with that. So it's an easy system to facilitate things that casual gamers can get into very, very easily. But simultaneously, even for want of a better expression, experienced or advanced gamers all tend to slip back to things like Call of Cthulhu as well, because it just has that thing built into it where, okay, you might not kill someone with a gunshot in one shot if someone's got a certain amount of hit points, but if they get hit a couple of times, it's going to be serious consequences. So you can reproduce danger and drama, and it's intuitive, and anybody can look at the character sheet and say, I've got X chance, roll the dice, they know whether they've succeeded or not. Yep. It's still got that weird thing going on where they duplicated the 3d6 approach to core statistics, but that's just like I don't know, that's an old school thing that's just stuck with time, isn't it? Because D&D was the thing. So they did the D&D thing.
It works quite well, though, the stats, because the sort of multiples to make a percentage chance, you've got a couple of the stats that sort of go into, 5 times for intelligence, for your education or idea, I think it is. And there's a dexterity percentage. And what I've found myself doing through the years was, most times, if a skill didn't fit, because you've got this finite list of skills, that it's like if something you're trying to do, it's likely in some cases 50-50 sometimes that it's just not going to be covered by any of the skills. So rather than try, look through the rule book or, pause the game like you might on, 3rd edition D&D horror stories that I don't even want to go into PTSD from, rules duels for an hour. But it becomes easier for me then just to say, do you know what? It makes sense that this is dexterity based. Give me 3 times your dex or 2 times your dex, depending on the sort of situation. And you've got to have that sort of ability to be able to make a fair assessment as to what that multiple is. But it's all on the fly, and it's all sort of, it's not written in the book to do that. But to me, it just makes sense. And I think the key for me is because I've always asked for feedback from my players on regular intervals. I think comes from a boring career, in civil service. But I always ask for feedback, and the feedback I had back was that they felt it was fair. And I think if you've got a situation where you can make a call like that, the players think it's a fair call, and it achieves you to be able to move that story along and not take the next 10 minutes arguing about what is and isn't. And that comes down to players. And I will say, because I did tell them I would, I have to say the group of players I've got at the moment are excellent, and they dive in. I had an hour worth of catching up between 2 party members who have been missing apart from each other for 2 hours for the whole second season, and they just role played throughout the whole thing. Even though they've been sat there listening to everything that's been happening, they went through it in character. No dice rolls, just chatting. But yeah, so I think it lends itself well. And to go back to that point you made a moment ago about the hit parry. What I tended to do to change that up a bit was get them to describe how they're doing that hit, how they're doing that parry, make them use the environment. You describe the environment around them, get them to be a bit creative, give them some, plus 5% for that. Yeah, great idea. Oh, I'm gonna kick the sand into his face, or I'm gonna drop to my knees and attack him. if somebody says to me, I'm going to attack him and makes the roll, I'm like, okay, yeah, great. But if they're going to add to that picture that we're all creating between us, and I know that sounds really boxy and apologies, but if they're going to add to that picture by saying, I'm going to do this little flourish with my sword, or I'm going to distract him by sort of, shouting over there or something, I'll reward them for that with a really sort of minor negligible percentage. But it's more about making sure that it isn't just roll, hit, roll, parry, roll. And it almost makes that, if that does go on for a bit longer, at least there's a bit of colour to it. At least there's a bit of flavour to it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, with you. Yeah, that all works. Yep, agreed.
There's all sorts of ways, isn't there? And, I don't think it's necessarily modern games that have introduced this, because I'm sure a lot of people have been house ruling this over the years. I can remember years and years and years ago when I think Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was probably in its second edition phase. There was, I don't know if it was a website or whether it was pre-websites, but there was certainly a zine for Warhammer that had all sorts of additional features that you could implement. Like it was before advantage and disadvantage were really being used. But you could flip your dice. So in certain situations, you could flip your dice. So 10s would become units and units would become 10s if you so wish to do that. And there were all sorts of different things, which a lot of which I think ended up getting adopted in Dark Heresy. And also Zweihander, the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay with the numbers filed off. Lots and lots of these options which originated with these like third-party approaches to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay to stop it being so problematic, because of course there were exploits in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Number 1, play a dwarf. Number 2, have high toughness. Nobody could ever damage you. So there were all these kind of exploits that people worked in through house rules. And it's just about not sticking to the letter of the rules, and that's something that you get in D&D, and I know it happened in 3.5 and 3. I never played 2nd, 3rd, 3.5 or 4th edition D&D. I played 1st edition back in the day, and I've played 5th edition a little bit. But the whole people with their handbooks interpreting rules differently thing is a very, very D&D thing, and having debates and min-maxers and all that stuff is a very D&D thing. Which, well, whatever. If people want to do that stuff, that's absolutely great. Good for them.
Yeah.
But I think D&D's the ultimate system for that. I mean, it seems to attract that kind of player, doesn't it? Min-max. I mean, it's almost like they're playing a computer game. I mean, maybe it's a generation thing. Maybe that, that's what the way they're used to thinking. I mean, I'm in 2 groups at the moment. One with Roy and Debbie doing a lot of RuneQuest. Quite heavy RP story play, more than, I don't think the rules are ever that prominent. We're doing quite a variety of games with them. In a Saturday group where we've just finished Masks of Nyarlathotep after over a year. And again, very RP heavy. My last character was an Aborigine, clever man, almost useless. Almost useless, but he had the odd flurry. I think he took them into the dream time and got them like a hex bonus or something, and he was not noticeable, but not a power character. Most of the characters in that campaign weren't on a power level at all. It was heavy RP, good fun.
That's the beauty of Call Cthulhu, isn't it?
Yeah,
if your character is a 62-year-old antiquarian. Back in the day, everybody wanted to play, can't I be a World War I veteran or something and bump up my combat skills? Just play a 62-year-old antiquarian who was too old to serve in World War I and get over it, Yeah, that's the stuff I like. Right, I'm sorry, I'm just going to take a moment to roll a dice. I've hit 3 again, so I have to count 1, 2, 3. So I am now going in for my Scottish beer, which is Last Mango in Balloch, Mango Milkshake IPA. By Loch Lomond Brewery. This is a Lidl special.
Mango milkshake. 2 seconds, I'm going to grab one out of the fridge.
Well, I tried the Lighthouse Lager, the Gower one, and it wasn't that bad, actually. So, I must apologise to the brewers for that.
Yeah.
So I think we'll do a bit of feeling foul.
Yeah, let's see how this one shapes up. I've been quite impressed with some of the cheap Lidl beers, to be honest. They've been all right.
That might be a challenge.
Yeah, it's all right. It's one of these modern IPAs that just tastes like they've mixed it with some juice, which I think is probably exactly what they've done. I think there is a certain amount of racketeering when it comes to craft beers, where they buy up a bulk load of dry hopped IPA and mix it with whatever they can think of, can it up, put a pretty label on it. Yeah. But it'll do. It's all right. It's all right for a Sunday afternoon.
I like the pun for the Hoptimist, though. I just want to say that quickly.
Good, isn't it?
Yeah, I like that.
It's a nice shop, the Hoptimist. I like it. He's so anybody listening, if you're in Leeds, Guiseley, the Hoptimist. I'm not sponsored by them, honestly, but I have had some nice beer from there. That's where I came across the Aunt Bess's roast beef and Yorkshire pudding brown ale. And I think they also had jam roly-poly and custard pale ale, which literally just tasted like it had jam and sugar in a pale ale.
Who was it?
I enjoyed it, but too sweet. Certainly not a session beer. And the brown ale, the Yorkshire pudding and roast beef brown ale, just tasted like they'd maybe stirred a bit of Bovril or Oxo powder into a brown ale. Which is fine if you like gravy and brown ale. Maybe not at the same time.
Not in the same glass, anyway.
Yeah. Loz texted me a while ago and said his brother-in-law was in a place in Stockport and he'd had a smoked porter that tasted like bacon sandwiches in a beer. Which I'm not sure about that. I mean, I love bacon sandwiches and I do like a porter, but I'm not sure about the combination. I would definitely try it, though.
I've had a German beer like that, a beer festival, like a smoked German beer. You couldn't drink more than 2 or 3 of them. That way.
The worst beer we have drunk on this podcast was a Russian Imperial smoked porter. It was dreadful. It was one of the worst things I've ever drunk in my life, and half of it went down the sink, and it was £9 a bottle.
Oof.
£9 a bottle.
Oof.
£9 a bottle. We do Loz and I tend to try and challenge each other. It doesn't always work out.
Well, it's the point of a challenge, isn't it? So
it is. You got to take the rough with the smooth.
Exactly.
Yeah. The only other one we've ever poured away was an Oyster Stout.
Oh, my word.
Yeah. I've no idea if it had oysters in it, but it tasted like it did. It was fucking horrible. So, yeah, that one went down the sink. That was many years ago. And funnily enough, I was going to mention this, we were playing another D100-based system at the time, which I really like. I don't know if you've ever come across Unknown Armies.
No.
I've heard of it, never played it.
It's about the idea that there's an occult underground, and life is normal on the surface, but there's this occult underground where people are, up to no good, or it's a little bit gonzo, a little bit weird, but very good. And I ran a game set in the early 80s. This is probably going back 10 years. Set in the early 80s in a town ostensibly on the fringes between North Yorkshire and Cumbria that doesn't really exist. Called it Ramsey after Ramsey Campbell. And I used the Unknown Armies system, and as is my preference, all the characters were people in the late teens or early 20s on the dole living on a council estate called the Copperhill Estate. So one of them was a barman in a pub called the June Whitfield. One of them was on the dole. One of them was a window cleaner. One of them ran a record stall at the local market and was called Electric Russell, but nobody knew his real name. And who else was there? Oh, yeah, and one of them ran a video shop called Veni Vidi Video, and they were the characters, and it was great. But the Unknown Army system is interesting because it's D100 based, so it's BRP-ish, but there's no set skill list. You kind of come up with your skills as you generate your character. And when it comes to things like fights, they're incredibly dangerous and brutal. So if you're unarmed and you're fighting someone with a knife, it doesn't matter what you roll, you take damage. Because if you get into a melee with someone with a knife, they're going to cut you to one degree or another. And I think one of the games, there wasn't a single fight in it until the very last moment. And it lasted 2 or 3 rolls. And then somebody rolled, Stu, who was a window cleaner, he rolled a specific roll that was, I think, if you matched tens and units on a roll, it would have disastrous consequences. So he punched this guy, matched tens and units on the roll, and killed him outright. That was it. So, but what was brilliant about that was there were then ramifications for that in future games because he was out on bail. Was it self-defense? And all this, yeah, it was really good fun. But yeah, Unknown Armies, if you like a D100 system with a little bit of, I know these days they call it storytelling games and narrative games, don't they? They never talked about that at the time when Unknown Armies came out. But if you can pick up a 2nd edition copy of Unknown Armies on eBay, well worth it. The system is very simple. The background is fantastic. Really, really intricate and detailed. The closest thing you could probably compare it to in terms of that really well thought out kind of background that's just really fantastic to read and just absorb yourself in anywhere. Something like Delta Green or something like that. Yeah, thoroughly recommend getting a hold of an old copy of Unknown Armies. I got the 3rd edition when it was released, where they split it into 3 hardback volumes, and it came in a slipcase that unfolds, as magnetic clasps, and it unfolds into a GM screen. Really kind of fantastic package, but it doesn't feel as interesting or vital as the 2nd edition. So yeah, definitely recommend getting a copy of that if you can get hold of one.
Just
anyway,
made a note. I'm going to be looking into that. I like the sound of that.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.
So slight digression there, but if you're both interested, I've got the write up of what we did was we did a collaborative approach to building the town. So my mate Sarah is quite a talented graphic designer. So we all sat down around the table and we came up with ideas for, what was around. So it wasn't me who came up with a pub called the June Whitfield. It was somebody else, and including the background lore that June Whitfield opened the pub when the estate was opened in the 1960s. There was a pub called the Black Pudding, a bakery called Big Biz Gripping Flans. Yeah. all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, I've still got the write up of the town, and Sarah has still got the map. She actually drew a map of Ramsey, and she's still got it on, I think on A2 paper, A2 like Bristol paper or something. She's still got it. Yeah, I'll send you the old Ramsey document, which I think got something like, I can't remember what it got to, but yeah, very much influenced by Unknown Armies and just our own memories of growing up in crap British towns in the north of England in the 1980s.
See, I love that sort of collaborative approach you described there. That's excellent. I ran Deadlands for a long time. I knew you mentioned Swadebringer earlier, and Savage World. Deadlands, the original Deadlands, before it became sort of slightly simplified by the Savage World sort of system. I ran that for a long time. For me, it was Vampire the Masquerade, Project Twilight, which was an offshoot of that, and then I went into Deadlands. All the while running Stormbringer. Anyway, the players had they basically had they managed to get all this little town, as is the want in these places. It sort of transports around different places, and I gave them carte blanche as to how they wanted it to look like. The sort of buildings in there, and the name of the place, and they chose Lost Vagueness, which I know has been stolen from elsewhere, but nonetheless, it was just like, that is perfect for you guys. But again, that sort of collaborative approach to, because you get, it's boring as it is. It's like, if you're leading a team, if you get them to collaborate into it, they buy into it, and it's no different in role playing. If you get them to co-create it with you, good Lord, you've got them. They're on the end of the hook. Like, so that collaborative approach, I love it.
It was really fantastic because everybody instantly was bought into it.
Yeah, exactly.
You didn't have to try and sell anything to anybody.
Nope. No, it's theirs.
Sounds very League of Gentlemen as well, no? A bit Royston Vasey.
Oh yeah, there's definitely an element of that. It was a lot of fun, and the sad thing is, because the players, some of them live in Hull, Loz lives in Manchester, I live in Bradford, so we used to get together. Loz would come here, would drive over to Hull, would play the game, would stay over. So everything became an operation. You couldn't just all meet up for 3 hours and play or 4 hours and play. It was all a major operation, and that was one of the problems. The other problem was we could only play about once every 3 months. So in between games, inevitably, people forget things. And it's really, really hard to keep things present in people's minds. I think as the GM, you remember more than the players sometimes, because players' attention wanders, for whatever reason. The other problem was, because we were all a group of friends getting together, it wasn't a case of, do we have a drink and socialise, or do we game? We would game and drink.
Yep.
So the games generally stopped when everybody was too pissed to continue.
Yeah, been there.
Yeah. So, and it's a real shame, but when we first kicked it off, I had this idea that it's the early 80s, they're all doilies or window cleaners or whatever, living in a shared flat or hanging around together. So I created an NPC called Clive Clutterbuck, whose dad ran a market stall called Clutterbooks. He ran the second-hand market stall that sold second-hand books. and he was their dungeon master. So the very first game we kicked off with them playing their in-game
Very meta.
game.
Very community.
Yeah. So and we played it for about 45 minutes, and it was typically daft fantasy stuff with him in a pub having a brawl, all that type of stuff in a tavern.
But sorry, just to be clear, you were gaming within the game. So
gaming within the game.
Within the game, yeah. Just to be clear. Sorry.
So the players were playing their characters playing characters.
Yeah.
And then about 45 minutes in, I say the phone rings, and that's where the game kicks in properly. So they have to put down what they're doing, put down the game, respond to whatever's going on. So that kind of set a tone for the game in that it all did become a little bit meta. And we were all completely shit-faced several sessions later, and as a GM, I'd not really done my homework properly, and they were in this house trying to figure something out, and one of them says, our players should play Village of Fear while we wait until for someone to turn up or whatever. Can't remember the exact details. So Sarah, one of the players, went and got her copy of Village of Fear and started setting up Village of Fear on the gaming table. We never ended up playing it. She was gutted because she spent about 45 minutes setting it up, and then we never actually played it. But the last game we ever played was they had to get on a bus and go from Ramsey to a place called Lower Dryfield. And we had this complete, not a history of Lower Dryfield, but all of their feelings about Lower Dryfield. Like there were rumours that in Lower Dryfield, people had corduroy teeth and walked backwards wagging their heads. Whatever, it's just stupid things. And it was all half joking. It's like, right, so we're setting up this idea for Ramsey, but what's the local rival town? It's Lower Dryfield. And there were reasons why nobody goes to Lower Dryfield. So it was almost like a Lovecraftian town that you don't go to Lower Dryfield. And it was only half a dozen references. But because we've been playing it for a while, they realised that they had to get on a bus and go to Lower Dryfield. There was a real sense of palpable dread amongst the players about having to go to Lower Dryfield.
Love it.
So they get to Lower Dryfield. They have to go to an old antique shop which closed in the 60s called Elder Things. Right. So they go to Elder Things. They find some bits and bobs. They find a notebook. They're on the bus back to Ramsey. It's like, right, what's in the notebook then? One of the players says. So I go, okay. And I hand out 5 character sheets for 5 new characters because the notebook is an account of something that happened in World War II, and they are all going to play the contents of the notebook.
Wow.
And that would be a complete session.
Far out.
So Sarah was pissed. She just went, I don't get it. What's going on? And I realised at that point it's probably about 12:30 at night. We've all had too much to drink. I said, don't worry, we'll get to it next time. And we never, ever got to it.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's just hanging, that. And it's been hanging for like 10 years. And from time to time, we do say, should we ever go back and play the contents of that notebook?
See, very similar. I fell foul of this because one of my players just outright said no. So I wanted to try something different. We had a Project Twilight offshoot of Vampire the Masquerade, FBI agents in that world. And one of the characters, he got a bit wacky. His soul got dragged to hell. He hadn't died. His soul was dragged, his body, he was dragged to hell. So I had this session idea. I thought, right, I'm going to do something different. So I wrote this out, the 7 circles of hell, and I had, things that would happen, depending on their choices that they made, the players. But to put the twist on it, I had that one character who was there escaping with a bunch of nobodies who were also in hell. So, of course, only one person was playing his character. The rest of the group were playing, nobodies, shit kickers from hell, let's say.
Yeah.
And one of the players just so I did the big intro and I did, right, this is what's going to happen. Here's your character sheets, and I honestly, I really put my heart and soul into this in terms of prep for it. And one of the players just went, "I'm not interested.
Oh,
I'm not interested. If I'm not playing my character, I like my character. I want to play that. I'm just not interested." And it was just And that is literally, I came across all my old Project Twilight stuff recently, and it's still there, handwritten on A4 bits of paper, which are going yellow now. Yeah. And it was just like, gone. Yeah, and I think it was because, with no disrespect to the person, I wanted to do that. Like yourself, try that something a little bit different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the lesson I learned is that's not always going to work. So if you are going to try something different, don't put too much effort into it.
Yeah, I think maybe I was disappearing up my own arse a little bit with some of this stuff.
That's pretty cool, though, Andy. I like that idea, and I like your idea as well, Steve. I mean, I think it's more about the group and the group dynamics. I mean, so our Call of Cthulhu's just finished, and we've over a year, every Saturday night. I mean, I'm in Swiss hospitals quite a lot last year, and I'm playing from my hospital room, on a tablet. That's how serious we took it all, And so now it's my turn to give the guys a break and to run a game. And, I'm running Suede Lankmar. And I think people are struggling to rationalise it because they're thinking Charles Dickens level poverty, beggars, street people, Lankmar. But I'm thinking weird Sorcerers and Sorcery, Wagner, Libar, Moorcock. I don't really want to be in a nitty-gritty city thing. So I ran Korgoth of Barbaria, my one-shot based on the cartoon. And if you've not seen that cartoon, look it up on YouTube. It's tremendous. But the players are still asking, what's the general tone of the game going to be? Is it going to be do contracts for the Thieves Guild, work your way up in the guild, or is it going to be weird Sorcerers and Sorcery? And to me, it's a bit of both. I mean, I don't have a meta plan at the moment. I'm still getting a feel for it, winging it. It's day to day almost, but they're used to a campaign that's ran for over a year that's fairly structured. And this is the plan. And that's just not the way I'm thinking, I mean, I'm looking for, ultimately it's weird tales. What am I reading at the moment? What can I turn into, something fun to run,
I think it's all about trying things, isn't it? You've got to try things.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've both listened to the episode on Fortress of Hell Part 3 that I did with Laws, put out a few days ago.
Yes.
And we
talked, most recent, yes.
Yeah, we talked
Brilliant.
At the end of that about how you do a Dreamworlds element of a campaign.
Yep.
Now, to me, these ideas of like going, whatever you want to call it, meta, or doing things slightly differently, that's how you should do a Dreamlands campaign. So what you talked about, Steve, with the 7 layers of hell, if the players go into the Dreamlands with the help of a Dream Thief or whatever, throw out your system, throw out all the rules and do something completely different and take the players out of their comfort zone. It's the only way it could possibly work.
Yeah.
And since having that conversation with Loz and since reading Fortress of the Pearl again, I'm really, really fascinated about the idea of how you make that work. And as we mentioned, and of course you'll know this because you've read the same supplement, the Dream Realm supplement for Mongoose Elric really missed the mark for me because... And actually, the Elric of Melniboné rules for Mongoose RuneQuest 2. You have a Dream Thief. You have a Dream Thief skill of X%. You go into the Dreamlands. You keep all your same skills. Gun tables. We won't go down that route. It just doesn't work. It's got to be wacky, different, outside of the comfort zone. And I'd do the same if I was playing Call of Cthulhu and you ended up in the Dreamlands. You've got to change the entire feel of the game.
Yeah.
And hope that one of the players doesn't say, no, I don't want to play a cat from Ulthar. Whereas I'd be like, no, you're all playing cats from Ulthar now.
Like it or not.
For the next 2 sessions.
Here
are your cat character sheets.
You're not leaving the house. I've locked the door.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Meow for me. Meow for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I was thinking about this recently. I had some ideas after that podcast because you touched on some good points. And I think Laws talked about Chat GPT and problems there with Moorcock and AI. And I've been doing a lot with Chat GPT to generate not just ideas, plot points, NPC stat blocks, etc. You're almost into a world of random tables from a Dreamlands concept.
Yeah.
How do you get the fleshy bridge? How do you get the flame lands? How do you get the lake that's... Was it the Sighing Lake? Coram?
Yes.
It was Elric, wasn't it? Rode across with the wingless Marehoon. Those are the kind of things you'd probably want in a Dreamlands. You're really looking at plot point type encounters, aren't you? And each
Absolutely.
one would probably take a night.
Yeah, give me a set of random tables that comes up with, I don't know, you roll a D10. Oh, lactating. You roll a D10 again. Lactating cupboard. You know, you roll a d10 again. Lactating cupboard full of small dolls' heads. Brilliant. Give me that. You reach for the door handle and it's lactating on your hand when you're trying to open the wardrobe. Fuck it, why not?
You know, all you've got to do, watch a bit of Reeves and Mortimer, a bit of David Lynch, and you know, just drag what you need in from that. Because what you just described there is a Reeves and Mortimer sketch you've ever, you know, that's Dreamlands to me. It's just that utterly random. But nonetheless, you've got to, in my view, you've got to put a bit of symbolism in there. Dreams are all about, you know, sort of symbols from the subconscious.
Absolutely.
So you can't just go surreal for the sake of it. You have to, but that has to be balanced with a little bit of that symbolism in, and a little bit of forethought to make sure it's not overtly obvious. So that your hope is that the players eventually will go, oh, I don't like this. Why is this? You know, what this is saying something to me, and I don't really know why. And then to eventually have that sort of light bulb moment and go, oh, you know, point at the ref and tell him you're gonna, you know, murder him in an alleyway with his lactating cupboards. But
I'm fucking using this in a game now.
You're gonna have to.
Well, at some point, I'm going to run Black Hack Ultimate Chaos Edition. So Goran is going to play it. So I'm going to surprise him. It won't be that much of a fucking surprise if he listens to this.
Told him. Well done.
It's really nice, though, isn't it? I mean, it's a lovely book. I mean,
it's fabulous.
I bought that because there's another group. I mean, in Switzerland, there's two big gaming groups. There's one, and they're all very organised, very Swiss. They've got places and, you know, rooms booked in different. You know, there's a Cuban bar in town. It's like a cigar place. We get to game in their cellar, and amongst all these boxes of cigars. The Swiss guys are great, but they're very focused on D&D. And so now they've kicked off an indie group, if you like, that plays more indie games. And they meet regularly, like once or twice a week, in different pubs around the town and play face-to-face. And that's why I bought this, because I'm thinking I could run that game, the Black Sword Hack, easily in a pub setting, face to face with people, not online. You know, it's a completely different, because I've got so used to, if it doesn't work on Foundry, then I can't run it. You know, and it's constrained me, if you like, for the best part of 2 or 3 years. You know, so that's why I bought it. It's just the right size, just the right level of depth to run something in a face to face pub context. You know,
there are a couple of reasons I really, really like it. One is I can read it in bed without breaking my wrist. And over time, I used to really love massive tomes, but I do most of my reading in bed now, so I want something I can just hold up. You can read it from cover to cover in an hour, yet still feel completely inspired by it. It's a toolkit as much as it's a system, and all of the advice, just some of the random tables, it inspires you to be creative and not just roll on the tables, but actually it's just a seed to wet your whistle and get your thinking, your grey cells going.
I like the magazine that came with it. You know, I hope they continue with that.
I do, yeah, it's really good. And not only that, but of course the art is fantastic as well, which adds to the immersiveness of it all. It's really, really great. And the system, once you've played it once, you'll never read the rules again.
Yeah,
it's so simple. One of the things potentially I think might be a problem with it, I really like the Doom dice thing, but in order to get the maximum benefit from that, you've got to have a lot of fighting going on. Otherwise, that Doom dice mechanic will never really come into its own. That's the only thing that I want to test through play.
Yeah.
But the Young Kingdoms is, you know, you can't avoid combat. I mean, it's again, my opinion, apologies for it's different. And I think if you're trying to be true to the books, that's going to be a natural part of it. You can't avoid it. So maybe that's you don't lose that benefit then.
Yeah, you just got to get used to regular character turnover.
Yeah, I've not read it, so the system. I mean, so I don't know.
It's very simple. Your characters don't end up with 70 hit points. No matter how many levels you go up, you can still be killed in 3 or 4 hits.
Great, I love it.
And you're never going to keep characters for long anyway in that kind of game. I mean, it's not a power game where you're looking to level up to 20 and hold a tower, you know?
Yeah. That is one of the reasons, though, why I think perhaps even if you have loads of fights, there's a fast turnover of characters, I'm not sure the Doom dice mechanic will ever really play out properly.
Oh, really?
Okay.
That's what's got to be tested through play, I think. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to test that out. Yeah, but that's something I'm going to look at anyway. So I'm going to roll one last dice for my third beer of the afternoon. It's a 1.
You're streaking on. I'm still on my second.
It's another Welsh beer. This is Purple Moose Brewery, and it's high hops tropical IPA at 5.5%. And we got this from Porthmadog when we were up there, when we were at Barmouth not so long ago. So I'm glad that I didn't get the Navigator, because that's 7% and perhaps maybe a little bit tricky for this time on a Sunday afternoon, particularly when I got a Cook Phil's tea after we're finished. But I'll just pour this out. So
I'm going to hit the local Irish bar when we're done, I reckon.
That's a good plan.
So
just to wrap things up, we've talked about Stormbringer, we've talked about the Mongoose role-playing games. What other games are out there that kind of follow the same kind of lineage, the ones that claim Moorcockian inspiration? We've just talked about Black Sword Hack, but what are the other games you've come across that you think could nicely accommodate a Moorcockian feel in a game?
Well, there was a bit of toing and froing on, I think, one of your posts this week. I can't remember who it was. Paul maybe talked about Luther Arkwright as a game to run. I have that, and he's right. I mean, it's very Moorcockian, just the story of Luther Arkwright. I hadn't actually thought about taking it out of the context of Luther Arkwright and running it as maybe a Jerry Cornelius game or but I'm reluctant to go back into. I mean, Mithras is great, but it's rules heavy. It's slow. I mean, Steve, I think from what you're saying and the sounds of your Stormbringer, and I read your write-ups, I enjoy seeing what you're up to.
Well, thank you.
You're running BRP because it's fast.
Yep.
And Mithras isn't fast. I mean, it's a lovely simulationist combat with combat styles and, advanced maneuvers and all these kind of things, but it's not fast. So that would be my worry with Luther Arkwright. More of the same. I think we're looking at Black Sword Hack. I think Mournblade, I really want it to get moving, but I'm not confident. I mean, there is a Foundry install for Mournblade, and it's pretty good, but it's all in French. And I speak a little French, but not enough, I think, to run with a whole Foundry instance where everything's in French.
Yeah.
Have
you looked into the Choose Your Dice system? I've got the Quick Start PDF that came with the Kickstarter.
Only briefly.
I've only briefly looked at it, so I've not really got my head round how the system works.
Yeah, me neither. I think the people that are doing it are great. I was on their Discord for a while, and I would chat to them with a Google Translate window open and, ask them different questions. I think they're real enthusiasts for a Moorcockian setup. But as long as it stays in French, we're going to struggle, I think,
Yeah. What about you, Steve? Are there any other systems out there, the ones that, in the introductions they say that they're inspired by Moorcock or they have Moorcock on the reading list? Are there any out there that you would recommend, or are you a pure Stormbringer man?
I don't know. I think I'm the latter. For me, I mean, I looked at Tales from the Loop. I quite like this sort of setting. The system was all right. I've run Aliens a few times, a couple of one-offs for that because I think it's best suited. And that's good because it's an experience in itself. But for me, Stormbringer, I think I've got to such a point now that I can tell my story with this system so easily. And I know that sounds, again, egotistical. I think what I mean is I'm taking barriers out of my way to write these stories and give my players a good time. Change for the sake of it, in my mind, just to try something different. Maybe it's just old man shouting at the sky sort of mentality, but I just think it's not for me. I can run the Stormbringer stories I want. I can run the multiverse stories I want. Bring a bit of Hawkmoon, bring a bit of Quorum. The Quorum system, by the way, I really, really want that so badly, but the prices out there are so bad. So if anyone's listening to this podcast and they have one for a reasonable price for somebody who'll make use of it, the plea is there. But no, I think I'd stick with what I've got. I genuinely wouldn't change it. If I'm going to run a different system, it'll be a different setting. So for Stormbringer, like I say, I can do my prep for the next. Each episode I prep depending on the exam. The outcomes and choices that players have made from the last session. I can do that in 3 or 4 hours, and I've got the next episode ready to go. If I have a new system, I've got to start thinking about, okay, well, how am I going to make that mechanic work? How am I going to? No, not for me.
Quorum's the best one. I would completely agree there. I mean, what to do is watch eBay around Christmas, times when people aren't spending money on frivolous things, you know, so maybe summer holidays, maybe Christmas. That's when you get these kind of bargains. I think I got my Quorum. I mean, it sounds trite, about $50, but it's as good as new. It's pretty much brand new, uncreased. You know, and
$50 is good. $50 is good. I mean, and, you know, 100 or plus, you know, and it's like I'm unfortunately I can afford it, but I'm that tight. I would not pay that for a book.
Yeah, it's just a case of keeping your eyes peeled. They do very occasionally. I keep an eye on it just because whenever I've got something rare, I tend to keep an eye on what they're going for, because the day will come when I'm skint and I've got to get rid of them all again, just like I did in the 90s.
Exactly.
Or the early 2000s or whatever, when I sold all my MERP gear for a song. So it's just a case of keeping an eye out, and eventually one will come up at a decent price. I think in terms of those games that claim that Moorcockian thread, we've talked about Black Sword Hack. There's one called Through Sunken Lands that I would recommend. I think that does a really, really nice job of mechanically, just through simple little things, helping you recreate quite Moorcockian characters. And it doesn't, you know, it's not about weird point systems for law and chaos influence and all that type of stuff. But I remember reading through it when I got a special slipcase edition for my birthday from my mum and dad from Black Earth Games. It's really, really nice. And there's just silly little things in it that you read and you go, oh, I like that, because this would help me recreate Dverk, for example. And one of them, it's a character feat or trait, which means that you can use your charisma in the same way that you could use strength or for fighting or dexterity if you're a finesse fighter. You can use your charisma for that, because you tell people off or intimidate them or engage in banter with them, and it enables you to use your charisma in duels and things like that. And the way it was described, I really liked, because it instantly made me think of Dverk. You know, just little things like that where they've taken a little bit of flavour from a book that they like or a text that they like, and they've made a game mechanic around, just a really super simple game mechanic around it. And there's lots and lots of stuff like that in Through Sunken Lands. So that would probably be my other recommendation of more modern games that help to simulate that kind of thing. But ultimately, I'm a lazy fucker when it comes to these things, and I'm a really lazy GM, and I almost always just end up using Barbarians of Lemuria and hacking it for whatever scenario I've created.
You mentioned that before. I did look at trying to get that as well, but that's another one that's tricky to find.
Yeah,
it's quite good. But don't you think it's
super easy?
But to me, it feels a bit like a cut down Savage Worlds. If I was going to run one or the other, then I would go Savage Worlds to have more options.
Yeah, it's super, super simple, because, I mean, I ran a sci-fi game with it late last year, and I thought, right, okay, so I'm going to run this sci-fi game with a specific theme, a specific flavour, and the entire concept of it is you have 4 core attributes, and you have 4 careers. And I did this for a game about German poets in the 18th century that I ran years ago, which all started off with, it was poetry night at the Moon and Pfennig, and one of the poets blows his own brains out, and they have to investigate the source of the madness that made him kill himself. And so what I had for the 4 core attributes was loving, fighting, talking, and something else. That was it. And you split 4 points between them. You can have 0 points in one if you want. You can have up to 3 points in any of them. And you just split them. And then you have 4 careers. So, you know, whatever you want. Farmer, entertainer, well, whatever. And do the same thing. And then it's 2d6 versus a target number of 9. But if you can argue that one of your core attributes and or one of your careers helps you in that role, that's it. So at the very core of it, it's like the old 2d6 versus target number thing. It's super, super simple, super straightforward. And for a bunch of casual gamers who are not really into complex character sheets and, you know, trying to explain why, I don't know, your strength is 17, but the important thing is a +2 bonus, you know, trying to interpret stuff for people. It's just really fucking easy. And you can automatically program in the flavour of your game. So for the sci-fi game, the idea was that there were specialist janitorial detail going to a space station to clean up a mess.
Oh.
Right? Simple. And then I had some index cards that just had, I think one of the things was their secret. The other one was a specific motivation that they had. That was it. So their entire characters were contained on an index card. Because I had shitloads of old index cards of various colours. So I thought, right, let's and that was it. That's all they needed. 2d6. You don't have to look at rules. You don't have to read a system. Super straightforward, yet still drenched in flavour. And that's the beauty of Barbarians of Lemuria. There are lots and lots of versions of 2d6 versus a target number systems where you have more options and more bolt-ons to add more crunch. But that's it. It's basic level. And because I'm lazy, that works for me. But not only that, it's because my players generally, when we tend to game in person, don't read rules. And even if I gave them a crib sheet for something like Mithras, absolute waste of time.
Never reading it.
Yeah, absolute waste of time. I could give them a crib sheet with all the combat manoeuvres, they wouldn't read it.
But you know your players, so you know that's what to expect. So you make sure that what you're writing doesn't require them to ever have to do that. You'll do the bits you need to for them in advance or at the time. And I think it comes back to something. Yeah, the Twitter RPG scene is a crazy thing, and I love it.
It's good though, isn't it? I think it's great, to be honest.
But there's some real wacky opinions, and I think one of the things I keep coming back to, and it's almost like I can cut and paste it now and just put it in as a stock answer, is there is no right and wrong. What you're describing there, Andy, you're talking about a simple system. Your players are going to enjoy. If they don't have to worry about anything, you can just say, okay, 4 stats, 4 skills, whatever. Yeah. And that's your lot. You get through a story, they have a good time, you have a good time. That is literally all it is. If anybody else says, exactly, and people say you must do this. If you're not doing it this way, you're wrong. It's like, no, you do what you and your players enjoy. That is literally the secret. That's it.
That's one of the weirdest things about Twitter RPG discourse, isn't it? The amount of energy people invest in you doing it wrong.
But do they? Because I don't see a lot of that. I see a lot of people complaining about people doing that, but I don't actually see many people trying to say you have to do it. I mean, it's maybe just the world, the Twitter world I'm in that I don't see it. And
it means you're doing a good job of curating your feed, Dave.
Yeah, I just don't see it. I mean, and general toxicity. I mean, I keep bashing them, but it's the D&D crowd, I mean, they seem to be in this world of, they're always complaining about something, and I generally don't see a lot of the grief that seems to happen,
You make a good point there, actually. I think there are just people that we interact with on Twitter who have one foot in that scene.
Yeah.
You've just said that, and I'm trying to think where I've seen firsthand these flame wars. And you're right, I've only seen people posting responses to the flame wars. Yeah. And one of the weird things is people posting, and this is, very much a Twitter thing, isn't it? People post, this is what I'm having for my breakfast. Fried bread is an essential part of any full English breakfast. People are doing the same thing with gaming, and it's the same across the board. It's one of those things. But ignore it, respond to it, do whatever you want.
Yeah, but the key is enjoy it. And you do what you and your players enjoy. That is literally it. That's the only point I would make.
Absolutely.
I think an interesting point about your index card game, and in general, that kind of lighter style of gaming, lighter rules type of gaming. I would never have dreamed of going into a pub in Scotland in the 80s or even 90s, or I don't even know about now, to be honest, and playing a role-playing game at a table with normal people round about us. Whereas now, I mean, I don't know about the UK, but here it's fairly common. It's not that unusual, They don't have a sports drinking culture the way we do, the Swiss, I mean, they just don't, I mean, my interview when I came over here and the guy said, what sports do you do? Because they all do sports. I said, I drink, and they all laughed, one of these pilots, they all laughed, thought I was joking. I was serious, that is my only hobby, so... But, to me, that's what these lightweight games are about, and I think the Swiss indie gamers group, they meet once or twice a week, they sit and meet in different pubs, they sit with these lighter weight games, and they have some really good role-playing sessions, and I think that's really positive,
Yeah. Well, I've only ever played in that kind of setting once, and it was Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Which is the only time I think I played it twice. I drove over to Hull. A good mate of mine invited me to go over, and his mate was running Pathfinder 2nd Edition playtest, and I'd never played it, and it was just like, oh, do you fancy coming over and giving it a go? And I was like, yeah, cool, I'll come over and give it a go. Really enjoyed it. Not my kind of game, not my style of game. Maps, tactical figures, combats that last forever. But they were good guys, nice guys. I could have a beer while I did it. But it was very odd doing it in this cafe, surrounded by people we were right in the window and people were walking past and looking at this bunch of middle-aged blokes sitting around a table with figures and double-taking and stopping and staring through the window at us to look at what we were doing. It's very odd, but you know what? We had a good time. That's the important thing, isn't it?
I mean
Littlewoods Cafe we ran. Sorry, I ran Stormbringer in a Littlewoods Cafe in Newport, which is got a certain cross-section of society, shall we say. And and looking back on it now, with absolute, I can feel my hands are sweating thinking about it, genuinely. But we were young, and they were mothers and fathers drinking their tea and sort of looking over, inquiring. There was some sort of younger generation looking over as if they were going to, they're doing something. Why are they reading? Not what are they reading? The old Bill Hicks kind of thing.
Yeah.
That was the sort of mentality, but we didn't care then. Yeah. Looking back now, I'd be like, absolutely not. Littlewoods Cafe, people ordering their sort of coffee and beans. No.
Yeah. But I mean, again, I don't know so much about the UK if it's a common trend, but here there are. I mean, I can think of a couple of pubs and cafes. Pub's the wrong word because they don't really do pubs here. There are places that do food and alcohol. There are games places. They've got board games on the shelves. You go in, you enjoy their hospitality, you pay for whatever, and you would sit and play board games, or in our case, role-playing games. I mean, there's 2 or 3 places I can think of like that, and I can't really imagine that in Scotland, certainly in Fife, where I'm from originally. But it's maybe changed. Maybe I'm being unfair,
Yeah. What you need to do is get back and do it, and mainstream gaming in Fife. Because that's what we're doing. By doing it in these settings, we're mainstreaming gaming.
Yeah. Lactating cupboards a year.
Absolutely. See people's faces when you're doing it in the Witherspoons in Fife when you're talking about lactating cupboards. Yeah. Well, you know what, fellas, on that, thanks for dropping by Derry and Toms to talk about your experience of gaming. We no doubt will end up having many more discussions about this and other things, but thanks for dropping by.
A pleasure. I enjoy the podcast, Andy. Steve, I love your updates. Great to follow what you're up to. I think you've really got the spirit of it, Great to see.
At least I know that one person reads it, so thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Well, what I'll do, Steve, is I'll post the links in the show notes so people can check it out.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think there's quite a few, Steve. There's a few people I talk to here that follow it regularly,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant! Because I do put a bit of effort into making a narrative. My players they're really grateful, but I didn't really think there was much of a following outside of that. But that's nice to hear. Thank you.
All right, cheers, chaps. Massive thanks to Dave and Steve for dropping by Derry and Toms. You can find Dave and Steve's blogs at tentacledwhisperer.wordpress.com and cruisingforamusing361905991.wordpress.com. Are you sure you're not a bot, Steve? Anyway, I'll link to these shows in the show notes, of course. Do check them out for some cracking content and Moorcockian gaming goodness. And naturally, thanks as always to our patrons. First, those without tier, Anthony Paconti, Tim Cardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And our chaos engineers, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Brandon Mays, Craig Ledley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Knight, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Mary Catherine, Matt Saltz, Menion, Nelbert, Paul McRandall, Scott Butler, Simon Perrins, and Tony Milazzo. And of course, to our crafty jugaderos, Alexander Harris, Ian Stead, Loz, Taylor, Matthew Broom, Toby White, Mark Hebden, and Graham Holden. And finally, eternal thanks to our patron demons, Andy Darby, Clarky the Cruel, David Lee, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Imria, Jenny Stim, Jay Reza, Joe Monty, Jason Vogel, Lee Gary, thanks Lee for the increased vote of confidence, Liam J, Miles Reed Labato, Mort Main, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, the OG patron Norman Beresford, And last, but of course, never least, Robert McMillan. And finally, thanks for all the positivity and best wishes over what's been a very interesting 6 weeks over here. It's very much appreciated. I love to read your words. Right, enough yakking. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. BITR Breakfast in the Ruins Radio is live on Radio Garden, liveradio.uk, or via the web player at breakfastintheruinsradio.blogspot.com. We have our Patreon page too, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. But for now, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.